Stop taking.
Hello and welcome to Module 2 of Medieval History, History 380. And this 2-week period, we're going to be looking at the Carolingian kings, the rise of Charlemagne and the development of the Holy Roman Empire, the division of Europe into a Eastern Christian Orthodox region and a Western Christian Roman Christian region, and then the region dominated by Muslim culture and Arab culture that was in southeastern Europe, and then all the way over into Spain as well. Of course, Byzantium or Constantinople will still be a very important part of this module as well. So that is where we are at. So first this information you should be reviewing chapter 2 now in your textbook by Conenberg and Briggs. So make sure you are up to date on your reading. You should also be looking back over, if you're just getting your textbook this week, chapter 1 as well for a review of what we did last week. So the medieval period, this period is somewhat warmer period. We often start in history these days by looking at the climate and the climate of the period and what that can tell us about this region. This was a time of recovery from about the 8th century to the 12th century of population. Europe had been decimated, towards the end of the Roman Empire in the 4th century by plagues, and now they're starting to recover from that. This is the era of the Germanic tribes and their invasions of the Anglo-Saxon, as they were called. These are two Germanic tribes, and the Franks in what is today Germany, and the Anglo-Saxons, of course, invade into Britain in these centuries right after the Roman period, and they began to cultivate the land. The rivers were their highways. The Roman roads had largely gone into ruins. Forests were for hunting. Remember how we read last week in the last module about the importance of games and hunting to aristocratic life. So large tracts of forests were often preserved from the axe, from cultivation, by the kings themselves. And there was also the simple fact that during these times, iron tools were scarce, and you simply couldn't fell a forest without iron axes. You were always under siege by the forests encroaching upon you, these giant beech and oak trees. And then I also like the point that your textbook makes about how Germanic paganism, and I use this term just to refer to the religious beliefs prior to the conversion of these regions to Christianity, that pagan religions worship the trees, and specifically the root of the trees. And this was specifically important up in northern Europe. In terms of the social history of this period, the family structure, or the extended family, is most important. And remember, we can contrast the extended family to the nuclear family, and the nuclear family is the mother and father and the children. Extended family could include grandparents as well, and then the children of the grandparents and their children. So it could vary in size, but family responsibility was often important as well because the family was so important. So you could you might often be punished if you committed a crime against the king or the church. Your family might also be punished, and punishments were pretty rough. They could take often a generation, as it says in your textbook, to try and recover from the debts that you owed. You might even be enslaved as a result of your crime. But I'll say a little bit more about slavery here in a second. But there is growing control as these regions become Christianized in the 7th and 8th century, as Britain becomes Christianized in the around this time as well, in the 7th and 8th century. The church extends its control continually over the family, over marriage. You might have had multiple marriages or polygamy in some areas of Europe prior to the Christianization. Now the church takes over the family in many ways and authorizes marriages. This sets up a situation where young people then want to strike out on their own and raise their wealth for their own family. So we see then the beginning of a little more emphasis on the individual and individual couples and relationships rather than the extended family. Look at map 2.1 in your textbook and look at the barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire. The times in life that were most dangerous at this time were childhood and childbirth. So not only were children themselves endangered when they were being born and in their infancy, but often their mothers would die of childbirth complications. Slavery was common, but gradually over these early centuries of the medieval period, it would become more or less and less common. Especially in Northern Europe, slavery never really, even in the earlier centuries prior to the medieval period, caught on that much there. The Romans, of course, practiced it all over their empire. Once they're gone, though, slavery is somewhat rare. The Irish were often taken into slavery at this time. In fact, there was in my readings, I understand that there was often trade slaving and swaps back and forth between the Irish and the Anglo-Saxon tribes on the mainland of Britain. Be very familiar with these maps of the different regions we're talking about, right? Where Britain is, where Ireland is, where Gaul or France is, and even try to familiarize yourself with some of these regional names like Burgundy in France, Lombardy in Italy, because they're going to come up in numerous situations as we're talking about. But slavery could be something you were born into. It was rather rare, especially, as I said, especially in Northern Europe, because of the cost associated with keeping slaves fed and cared for through the cold winter months. So they very quickly moved into situations where it was piecemeal type of work, that you would work in the winter, work in the spring and summer, maybe into the autumn for the harvest seasons, and then you wouldn't be working in the wintertime. This is going to change in some areas as feudalism strengthens, as serfs are fed all through the winter. And we can also contrast slavery, chattel slavery, which did exist, especially in the Roman Empire, with the semi-free serfs, the peasants living on those fiefdoms, on those feudal estates. Gift exchanges were often important as well. Gifts were not just to be received, but to be exchanged. A couple of terms to be familiar with. your textbook talks about the conspicuous consumption and even conspicuous waste of the Middle Ages. Conspicuous consumption is when you consume, sometimes literally at banquets, large amounts of wine and mutton, sheep, lamb, and you're showing off. I think we're all quite familiar with conspicuous consumption in our age of consumerism. They did it in the medieval ages. The aristocrats did it a lot. The one thing that we have associated in our popular culture, I think, should be noted on, and that is the tradition of burying treasure with the dead. This is more and more going out of fashion in medieval times, largely due to the fact that the church wants these treasures. They don't want you to be buried with them and have all those gold coins or chalices, bejeweled crowns and swords and all sorts of any sort of artifacts you can think of. They don't want those to be buried away under the ground. They want to have that wealth. The church does. So as Europe becomes more and more Christianized over these early centuries of the medieval period, that practice will become less and less common, although it's still, I think, wedged into our popular culture, right? The idea of buried treasure and medieval treasure and leprechauns and their pots of gold, right? So think about that. It's important to emphasize that Western Europe in these early centuries is isolated and underdeveloped compared to Byzantium, otherwise known as Constantinople. But we do begin to see in these centuries the evolution of money. Currency used in exchange. The silver penny became one of the first coins in common usage among the common people, for example, in Britain at this time. Now, still, a lot of people wouldn't even have access to these coins. It would only be the more wealthy people, and the poorer people would have still been using bartering system, trading things back and forth. But we also have at this time the introduction of book writing with the spread of Christianity. Of course, we have this emphasis on the Bible, on the holy book of the Bible. And I'll talk here in a minute about monasteries and the church's efforts to translate the Bible and wasn't translated into too many languages, however, at this time, but it was translated into some. The church will become, as the Middle Ages moves forward, more and more firm on the fact that the Bible should only be in Latin, but that they were more flexible about that in the early centuries of the medieval era. And then we have the arrival of the Vikings, the plunderers. These were kind of a nomadic people. Well, they had their centers of home back in the Scandinavian countries, and then they went out on their plundering missions. They wanted to find riches to bring back. Now, your textbook makes the point that even though they may have plundered these regions, a lot of they usually returned for more, and often returned with the very plunder that they'd come back with, and they begin also using coinage later on as well, which makes wealth more transferable, right? That you can take a stow of money and you can haul it over to another place, and when you come back, he's like, oh, we're not plundering now, but we brought lots of gold coins to trade with you for other things. So keep that in mind. There's lots of talk in your textbook about the Frankish alliance. Of course, towns like Frankfurt and that have the names rooted in this Frankish history, in the kind of Germanic tribal areas of Western Europe. Pippin was probably the most famous of these kings to make a name for himself outside of France. The Frankish kings were both there in northern France and extending into what is today Germany. Pippin was kind of almost imperial in the way that he led armies all the way into Italy. And then you have the rise as well of perhaps the most famous of the emperors at this time, or the kings at this time, who is crowned an emperor, and that is Charlemagne, 1765 to 1814 to 768, I should say, to 814 were the years of his life. Personality is really important at this time to how successful a king might be, and even size, because we're in this time, I think I mentioned it last module, where the physicality of life is very, very important, right? We like sports and that now, and strength is very much appreciated. But at this time, being tall, and Charlemagne was quite tall. He was a warrior. He was also had that mixture of characteristics of being cunning, being interested in astronomy and knowledge of the world, and he's going to be important because he's going to be crowned the emperor of all the Saxon lands of Christian Europe. And he subdues the Frankish kings like Pippin before. Pippin was a famous one, but the Frankish kings are going to be defeated and brought into what will become known as the Holy Roman Empire. Count Roland is one of these great Christian heroes of this time. The Holy Roman Empire, the famous thing that has been said about the Holy Roman Empire before is it wasn't that holy, and it wasn't altogether Roman. This was really nothing like the old Roman Empire. It's more held together by the church itself. And this is what is odd about it, that the Pope will crown Charlemagne the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. A lot of this has to do with the growing strength at this time too of the Eastern Church, and it emphasizes this split that I mentioned earlier between Eastern Christianity based around Byzantium or Constantinople and Western Christianity based around Rome and what is known as the papacy. Charlemagne is crowned emperor of all the Christians in this western part of Europe. And this is going to be called the Holy Roman Empire. Look at map 2.2. You can see the Carolingian empires. But these Carolingian empires are going to go into retreat, and they're going to be largely then replaced by the Holy Roman Empire. And let's take just a little more of a look here at the British Isles. The British Isles are really, really quite a fascinating place. I study Irish history, but modern Irish history. The Irish peoples of Britain really have a diaspora, dispersal across. They come out of Ireland and what is England, and they become known as Celts. They move into northern France and on to as far south as Galicia in Spain. There's still amongst people who follow Celtic culture, there's a controversy of how many of these medieval Celtic nations there were, but they were widespread. Scotland, Ireland, like I said, northern Spain down to northern Spain and northern France. The largely it's a myth of St. Patrick's conversion of the Irish. I mean, St. Patrick's did exist, and he was a missionary. I'm just saying that a lot of the stories that have become associated with him, such as driving the snakes out of Ireland, are more myth than fact. But they show you the veneration that later generations will have for this missionary who comes to Ireland. And it's really, though, the Viking invasion of the British Isles that challenges those regions. You should be familiar with, for example, the famous sacking of the monastery at Lindisfarne in what is now northern England, right on the border there with Scotland in 793. This was one of the first of the movements of Vikings into the British Isles. They'll be back, but they will also, the more they come back, the more they will begin to settle there as well. And the Vikings will go as far as Greenland and to a place that they called Vinland, which is really in that area of what is today Nova Scotia in Canada. Vikings often took slaves, and some of these were often the Irish. Vikings went as far south as France, mostly they called it Gaul in those days. In Spain, they had these long, mobile, stealth and mobility on the sea. That was their main weapon. Then they almost used a shock and awe kind of attack strategy, right? You attack at night sometimes in these long boats made with dragon heads on them. There are actually letters that we have found, ancient letters from monks from this period, who are writing to other monasteries about staying up late and in fear and grave fear of Viking invasions in the night. But the Vikings will eventually also convert to Christianity, and they will also bring a lot of their language to our own English language. Words I know like sky, for example, are Viking words or Scandinavian words. And then you have the rise of Alfred the Great of Wexford's, and he's a defender against the Vikings. He counters them at sea. Alfred was this educated man, encouraged all men to learn to read and write in an effort to spread Christianity. And he becomes a kind of a folk hero during this time. And for a while as well, England is this part of Britain, which is England now today, is controlled by Danish kings. This emphasizes the importance of the Scandinavian influence and the legacy of the Vikings. But as I come to an end here, I want to talk about the development of feudalism, which you read about last week in Life in a Medieval Baronry. Feudalism is all loyalty based between the lord and his vassals, or the king and his vassals. It was the cement that held the political system together. But it was complicated, as your textbook points out, by greed, by fear, and by conspiracy. that's what makes it so fun to study, right? Because it's kind of like sort of some of the themes that you see in Game of Thrones and those other sorts of things that don't have much history in them. But feudalism did have all of that intrigue and plotting and conspiracies, right? Because it was a decentralized form of of governance. The other thing I want to point out about feudalism is it really has its roots in a change in military tactics. The change that came from the importance of the horse or the service of the knight to the king, right? And this has to do with the development of a piece of technology, a tool brought from China, and that is the stirrup, which made which made it possible for you to arm yourself and to swing a sword while in the saddle, because you get that stability because you have your feet firmly planted in the stirrups and kind of fastened in there, right? And you get some leverage. You don't fall off your horse. This revolutionizes cavalry. Your textbook, I love this term, refers to it as the equestrian battling ram, right? It gave knights and men on horseback who could afford the training and the equipment. This equipment is really expensive, right? Because you need to become the battering ram. You just don't need the best and sharpest swords to wield on your horse, but you also need armor for both your horse and yourself. So the lords rely upon knights for military power. Okay, and why we're talking, or while we've mentioned Vikings just a short time ago, let me also mention the Magyars. These are the last of the Eastern Nomadic invaders. Remember we talked about the Huns in our last module, which did so much to destroy the Roman Empire near its end. Well, we could also add the Magyars that come up from Central Asia. Again, it's people on horseback, German, come into Germany and into Italy. But this will be the last of these invaders from the east, at least up until the 13th century, when the Mongols will again come into places in Eastern Europe. Okay, and as we wrap up here with my main points for this week, let me emphasize how the Europe then is split up into these three large regions, largely over the iconoclast controversy. This is a controversy over icons, over images, and it starts with disputes about the importance of and a growing concern around this time by not just Christians but by Jews and other groups about the second commandment and idolatry, the worshiping of idols, and it increasingly becomes something that the Eastern Orthodox, what were known as Constantinople and Byzantium at that time, will support the use of these icons, which are really everywhere. Even in Christian life in Western Europe, you would find lots and lots of these sorts of engravings. Some were tapestries made of cloth as well. Some were thought to be relics. Reliquaries were very important at this time, increasingly important at this time to the church. Those are the place where holy relics had some sort of historic value, like Jesus's shroud, for example, to Christians. Well, the split is in the iconoclast split. That the West will become increasingly skeptical of icons, while in Byzantium and Constantinople they continue to use them. Of course, they will continue to use them in Rome and Roman Church, Roman Catholic Church as well, but not to the extent that they do in the East. And it's much later, much later period that we have the rise of reformers who would try to do away altogether with icons. So, but we're way before those sorts of ideas. The last thing I'm going to mention in this lecture is the importance of the monasteries and monastical life to medieval life. Monasteries were part of the great religions of Asia and the Mediterranean. Most great religions, large religions, have some sort of monastical institutions or monastical vows that some people take, often vows of poverty, as in the case of monks at this time. The order of Saint Benedict was very important at this time. It ordered regular work combined with literacy, so you work and you get learned, and monks were held in high esteem. Now, don't get confused here. Even though monks might have had to take a vow of poverty, the institution, the monastery itself, did not, and they would remain very, very wealthy places. But monks were thought to be intermediaries between God and man. The importance of those monasteries were not lost upon those invading Vikings that I said that's one of the favorite things they loved to sack, right? Were the Lindisfarne in England monastery, for example. But then there is later on the Cluny reforms that are made, named after a monastery in France, which emphasizes not so much the working aspect of and the discipline of work and then literacy, but on the human knowledge. It's almost sometimes considered a Renaissance before the Renaissance in Europe. In other words, these monks were not just interested in what we might call biblical questions and theology and devotion, but they're also interested in expanding human understanding, in astronomy, even in fermentation and distilling, for obviously reasons, right? But also in philosophy, and they become known for their great book-making abilities. And they really begin to emphasize education and literacy. And if anyone ever gets a chance, so you can go online and view some pictures of the Book of Kells, for example, which was found in Ireland. You can get an example of this kind of renaissance within monasteries that was going on. This is a beautiful, what they called illuminated manuscript. Beautiful, beautiful book with the Celtic characters and symbols incorporated into it. And there was a lot of local variation in the type of illuminated manuscripts that were going on at this time. Okay, well, that's a lot of material for you to digest this week. I'll have the discussion for you also to participate, and make sure that you post at least 3 times and try to do it on at least 3 different occasions, so over the 2-week period, when you log in, don't just log in and look at things and then log back out, but log in, look at the conversation, or post for the first time so you can see the full conversation, and then add your part to the conversation. All right, I will see you all in the next module. Stop taking